yeah, I'm a farmer. I run Frith Farm in southern Maine, and we grow vegetables. That's our main thing. So that's kind of my perspective. Agroforestry is such a huge topic, but our focus is intensive no-till vegetables. So coming at it from that angle, how to add perennials into that in a way that kind of enhances production, quality of life, all of it. So, yeah, here's a little, that's, there's the farm title slide. I'll get into all of our practices. So yeah, the outline, here's the classic, what I'm gonna say, then I'll say it, then there's what I said. So, we'll talk about how the farm is laid out. I think that's a big piece of how we grow vegetables, but it also really helps organize and make sense of perennials, adding perennials in that can be so complex. But having the farm laid out in such a way that they're a little easier to manage and keep track of can really help. Talk about why add perennials. There's a little bit of redundancy with what's already been said, so I'll go fast over some slides. I think, you all are here, so you know a lot of the benefits. And then, design considerations. I guess what makes me a little unique is that, I've been growing on this land for 14 years now. Perennials added in, maybe as long as 10, 11 years. Now we've had some of these hedgerows. So I've seen the arc of, the different phases of that. So I have a little bit of hard-earned insight that hopefully you can avoid making some of the mistakes I did. And then, just a lot of photos to show examples and riffs on different ways to do perennials. And then, highlighting, like Ian did, some of the work involved. Perennials are not as much set and forget as some of us like to think. And then, of course, the benefits, the rewards of doing this, which I think are numerous and stacking and hard to quantify. So a little overview of the farm. This is the land I purchased just over 14 years ago. It was an empty field, hayed once a year to keep open, but pretty blank canvas in terms of my vision for a vegetable farm. The house actually brought down the value of the land a little bit, so that was nice. It was sort of condemnable state, so being, in my early 20s, I moved right in, and lots of good adventures sort of renovating that over the years. But here we are last year. This is the farm. We're 3.5 acres of very intensive no-till vegetable production. Also herbs and flowers. It's hard to measure the perennials because they're in and amongst all the annuals, but probably another 1/2 acre of perennials. And we're about 10 full-time seasonal workers, maybe closer to 12 now. So you might notice that ratio, I like to point that out, of workers per acre. It's an intensive production. And we sell about a little over half of our produce goes through a CSA, sort of a subscription to the farm. Everybody picks up at the farm. The other half goes to natural grocers and a little bit through a farm stand. We feed 300 families in our CSA, but it's probably over 500 families worth of produce, from 3.5 acres. So that gives you a sense of the intensity of it. Gross revenue is over $400,000 a year from that acreage. That gives you a little bit of overview. This is our layout. And you might say, what does this have to do with perennials? But it really does, I think, help organize it all. So we have 16 plots. Plots are all standardized. I could harp on that. Standardize your plots just for ease of of planning, record keeping, irrigation layout, row cover length, tarp sizing, all of it, to standardize it, and a lot of headaches disappear with that simple decision. So we have 16 plots, there they are. Each plot has 12 beds. Beds are 5 feet on center, and 100 feet long. And then, you could have like little signs between plots to let you know where they are, but why not have a perennial strip between them, which acts as a visual marker, but also a, insertion of perennial diversity right into the annual production. And then just practically, vehicle access at the head and foot of each plot. And then wherever there are triangles or little odd spaces, which is inevitable if you're going to standardize your plots, that's beautiful space for more perennials. So don't view that as a waste of space. If you're used to going like tree line to tree line, it's actually a great opportunity. So here's like a first year, we call them beneficial beds or Benny beds, the crew starts calling them. This is like first year, they're small. We start pretty much everything from seed, the perennials, and transplant them out. I won't get into the bed prep stuff of it because that's a little more just like no-till, but we prep the bed and treat it just like we do our regular vegetable beds. It's the same dimension between them. I'll talk a little bit more about that, and you might want to consider making it wider. But ours are 5 feet center to center. And our mantra is never see the soil. So everything's always mulched, including the beneficial beds. And if you start with all the perennial plants killed, all the perennial roots of your pasture or whatever, if you kill those with tarping or tilling or whatever, and then mulch over that with a nice thick layer of plantable compost, then whatever you plant into that is going to be weed-free for a decent amount of time, for a season, really. Maybe you got to, hand pick a few weeds that come up through that. But that's the basis of our, production system for vegetables. So we use the same thing for perennials. That makes establishment much easier and cleaner than if you were to try to just broadcast or transplant into bare soil or whatever. You'd have a lot more management issue with competition. We kind of have a zero tolerance for weeds in our system, which is made easy by that permanent mulch layer. So here's more established hedgerow. This is, I don't know how many years old, 8 or 10 years old. These shrubs have reached their mature height. Definitely packed in things, probably a little too big for a 5-foot center to center bed, but it's actually amazing how little they compete, even though they're kind of hanging over the crop. I'm always remarking at that. One of my good friends, a farmer near me, says shade is the new fertilizer. I like that. During drought, shade is like a fertilizer. So you guys probably have that even more down here where it's warmer. So to actually have a little shading out of adjacent beds can be a real benefit. You can even tweak your crop plan to grow, the cooler season crops during the heat of summer, where they get a little shade, partial shade during the day. So again, pictures worth 1,000 words, showing the different hedgerows, the Benny beds. I kind of went crazy. I'll talk more about species selection, but I just kind of, threw everything but the kitchen sink in there. I would recommend doing a little more like blocks of the same species, maybe at least like 5 bed feet at a time, just for ease of management. And there are sneaky things that will come in here. This is sort of a wild strip in the middle of our annual production. And there are plenty of, wild plants that will be planted there by birds pooping or wind or whatever. So if you don't recognize those, some of those you might not want because they can be pretty aggressive, like asters and goldenrod, and then start creeping into your beds. So by having it a little more organized you could recognize when things have moved in and address those early before they're, really established. I do love the wild, beauty of this, but yeah, a little bit more organization and a little bit more conscious choosing of well-behaved perennials. There are some, perennials that just really want to travel and that self-sow aggressively. Almost all of them will self-seed to some degree, but yeah, some really travel and become weeds on adjacent beds. So getting into the particulars of that, I think the next presenter will be more like species selection for this area. I'm not going to get too much into it because mine are for, southern Maine, which might be a little bit different than here. But yeah, all the considerations of what to put in there. Some more examples. You might notice we have fruit trees. We put dwarf fruit trees in our hedgerows as well as woody shrubs, as well as herbaceous perennials. That's another key takeaway from years in the trenches with this is I would decouple your woody perennials from your sort of mixed herbaceous perennials. And that is so you could flail mow the herbaceous perennials at the end of the year for maintenance if you wanted, cut back all the debris so that they can grow up clean the next year. We can't flail mow the beds because we have woody perennials in there. So my ideal might be to, instead of leaving one 5-foot bed, leave 3 5-foot beds. And then the middle one could be your woody perennials, shrubs and dwarf trees, whatever. And then the side beds could be your herbaceous perennials, so you could flail mow those sides. And then choose the height with intention so that the herbaceous perennials aren't like growing up and outcompeting your trees, because there are herbaceous perennials that get 12 feet tall. So here's another picture. You can kind of see the perimeter. Basically, our plots are surrounded by these kind of hedgerows, beneficial beds, whatever you want to call them. And just to reiterate, what's already been said, the amount of wildlife, the birds, the insects that come in from this is remarkable. It's if you try to think like a bird, put yourself in a bird's wings for a second, and like if you just see a big open field with nowhere to land except the ground, that's not a hospitable place to fly. Birds want to land. A lot of birds want to land on things. So just having one little shrub with a branch on it, well, all of a sudden now birds can come into the field. So having that around all the plots, it's like the amount of birds that come in is amazing. And again, a theme of this is like, I don't have scientific data to like prove how many more birds are there now. I love the Merlin app thing, though. I'm going to use that. But I will say we don't spray any pesticides. We use some row cover for flea beetles, but otherwise we don't really have pest infestations. That doesn't mean we don't have pests. We have some, but they're part of the ecosystem. Yeah, I like that quote. Like, if something's not eating your vegetables, then they're not part of the ecosystem. Like, there's going to be something there, but it's held in check by the balance of all the natural predators that have habitat to be there too. So this is our woody perennial map. This is just made with Google Earth, just to give you a sense of, the integration of these woody perennials into the annual production. We have probably a couple hundred fruit trees and a lot of shrubby stuff. And this is just the woody stuff. I didn't even try to map the herbaceous stuff because it travels too much and changes too much. But yeah, just looking at how integrated it is among the plots. And again, thinking like birds or wildlife, like that becomes a hospitable place to explore. So yeah, why care about perennials? This is a sort of succession continuum map there's lots of these, but this one kind of highlights the different soil biology that happens, that changes as we go through natural succession. And our scientific minds love to think in lines, like linear, like this is a progression, going to the right is better. But where the magic really happens, the magic of life and diversity, is at the edges of different phases of this line, of this spectrum. So, we're gonna have the most diversity, the most exciting interaction of life where there are shrubs and trees next to annuals. At the edges of different ecosystems. So this stuff gets me excited. I don't know. I'm just like, how can we get as many edges and as many like little micro ecosystems together as possible while producing annuals? Producing annuals from the land is asking a lot from the land, like year after year after year. Annuals are traditionally like a Band-Aid after a huge disturbance, and then nature moves in with perennials. So if we are going to do that year after year, which we are, like we like vegetables, we're going to grow vegetables, let's try to do that in a way that mimics and brings in some of the diversity of more perennial ecosystems. And diversity is resilience. Again, talking about pest control, we can zero in on all the examples of like the parasitic wasps and and everything, but it's really just the more life, the more niches there are, the more resilient those are to like a pest infestation. Pest infestation is really like, to me, it's a messenger that there is a lack of life, there's a lack of diversity. So, with all respect, sometimes you need to kill the pest, but in doing so, we're actually perpetuating the very problem that caused the pest, right? We're reducing the life. Sometimes if you can leave a little bit of that pest there long enough, then the natural predators move in and the ecosystem can start to spiral upward instead of, keep spiraling downward. I get that a lot with no-till, like, oh, you use wood chips, don't you get slugs? Well, yes, you get slugs, but then you get snakes and frogs and amphibians and all the rest that move in eventually. So there's maybe a year or two of like slug pressure, but hold the course, don't give up, and your ecosystem will start to build. So beneficial plantings, all the benefits. This has kind of been said, so I'm just going to go through very quickly. The diversity, it's a reserve for a whole different slew of soil organisms than annual production. So if you can have that reserve inserted like into your annual production, it can kind of seep out and mingle and populate the faster turnover crops, the soil for them. Natural pest control, I've been talking about that. Pollinator food and habitat, that's been said. And then, there's production that can come from this as well. Berries, fruits, flowers, herbs, medicinals. It's funny, medicinals, like basically every single plant is a medicinal if you know how to use it. And then this one, beauty. Where does that show up on the revenue sheet, But it does. It's in there. It absolutely does. If you work in a beautiful place, you're going to be happier and you're going to work better, and it all feeds into itself. So, having a place like this to work, it's like the insects love it, the birds love it, but like the humans love it too. What is that worth? How much effort is that worth? To me, like that's what life's about, is creating beauty. So. But again, pretty much any plant can be medicinal, but definitely just multiple uses, the stacking uses of different plants. And these are some of the triangles on the farm that are just sort of awkward in terms of the layout of our rectilinear vegetable production, but they are wonderful places to just stick like perennials, and also just some of these are annual flowers, like wherever there are bare spots, we just put extra flowers that we have left over and fill it out. So every year it's a little different, and the crew loves kind of just planting the extra flowers around. Yeah, mycorrhizal fungus. I'm assuming we all know about that by now, but this is the great underground web that connects all plants. And annuals, it's very hard to grow annuals in a mycorrhizal network. So having perennials there to hold that, and then, so the annuals can tap into it briefly while they're there, makes a lot of sense. In terms of root soil contact, yeah, this is mycorrhizal fungus increases that contact by up to 100 times. And the mycorrhizal network doesn't survive without that root contact, right? It's a symbiotic thing. So as soon as you are growing annuals and have a gap, where there's no living roots in the ground, that network's going to be dying. Perennials benefit that. And yeah, all the benefits of that. And all the beautiful, communication that happens underground through that network. So yeah, that's kind of what we're thinking about when we're planting, all these woody perennials right alongside of the vegetable plots. Imagining that, communication and that interfacing, that edge effect, and we really see it. There's a lot of fear about competition, but I haven't seen much competition. Honestly, we had a walnut tree get probably pooped into one of our beds by a bird, and it's now it's 30 feet tall in one of these 5 foot wide beneficial beds, and I can't bring myself to cut it yet. I might, but I always learned walnut trees, juggaloons, the compounds will be released and there'll be nothing growing around it. So far we're growing vegetables, 2 feet away from the trunk of that, and they're doing great. So I think there's a lot of fear out there, but if the biology is there, I think there's more symbiosis than competition. So yeah, thinking about how to support beneficials, I think this was said too. Providing plants with diverse flower shapes, diverse colors. I think that's important to note, and overlapping bloom periods throughout the whole season. Again, just think of diversity and abundance. The more quantity and the more diversity, the better. Sometimes we get the very, very cute little, I'm going to plant a marigold at the end of each bed, and that's great, that's beautiful, but we want some abundance too, enough that insect populations can actually build, and then enough diversity that, those overlapping bloom periods with a diversity of colors and flower shapes throughout the season. And then, this was covered wonderfully, the native shrubs and bunching grasses for overwintering habitat. It's not just nectar and pollen, right, that they need to survive the winter too. And this is a big one. Don't spray if you can hold off, because keeping low levels of pests present actually sustains the beneficial insects. Many insects rely on those pests as a food source, as a reproductive, source. So if you're wiping out, just pressing delete on the entire population of pests, you're breaking that life cycle of the higher order predators too. It's not so simple as good, bad, right? It's an ecosystem. So yeah, these are the beneficial beds between each plots, kind of spring, fall, continuous blooming throughout the season. Again, some more examples. Yeah, plenty to say there, but I think I've said it. I'm noticing one big weed here up front, and I'm like, like the sneaky things that can move in there, and then I think it's fleabane there in the front on this right one. So there's an education learning curve too of being able to identify what you have growing, and also training your crew so that you recognize when like an aggressive spreader seeds itself in your Benny bed, and you can like pull it out before it does all of its aggressive spreading. So yeah, that's been a learning curve. And again, just simplifying the design a little bit, doing blocks, I think would help like highlight that. Yeah, this was mentioned too, proximity. Proximity counts. This was one study that just was measuring the parasitization of eggs, a distance into the field from a hedgerow. And, this is just one study, like it drops down, kind of peak was 10 meters in or whatever, 30 some feet. So I love science, and I don't like dig into, I don't get too nerdy with it. I'm just like, oh, well, that means the closer the better, So basically I came up with, well, I'm gonna have flowering diversity, perennial diversity within 50 feet of everything we grow on the farm. That seemed like a reasonable balance of like close but not so chaotic that I can't still have a block of vegetables. So again, here's that map that kind of shows how we did that. And again, having that standardized plot system, perennials between each one, that kind of takes care of that. It's an ordering principle. And there's hopefully a familiar sight of the parasitized tomato hornworm. It's interesting. We tend to get a flush of tomato hornworms every year. Make sure to leave these. If you see these, leave those on the plant, because that's the next generation of the braconid wasp that then takes over. So we pick hornworms for the first couple weeks, but then this wasp takes over and they all get parasitized. It's pretty cool to see. We also plant sweet alyssum as an understory crop for our tomatoes, which is the food source for these wasps. There's a good patch of yarrow. Again, a great, super easy, gateway perennial if you get you started. So here are some of the species we use. I imagine a lot of these are native to this area as well, but the next presentation will get into this, I think. So again, bloom period, early spring through late fall. This is a great way, I agree, this is a great way to get organized in how you're thinking about what species. This is, what we have used. I would be a little cautious with the goldenrod and aster, because they are kind of aggressive. And then the native grasses, big blue stem, little blue stem. And then shrubs, again, I would decouple these. I would plant these in a separate row than the herbaceous, just so you can manage them separately. Maybe still plant an understory, shade-tolerant ground cover under them, but something that's not going to grow up into them and create a tangle. Tall shrubs, 8 to 15 feet. A lot of these produce, product too that you can sell. In general, shrubs are about as wide as they are tall, so these would require that much width without kind of hanging over onto your crops. And then the shorter shrubs, we have more of these in our Benny beds because they're narrower. And then I always like to look to nature. This is our roadside ditch, and it's just like boom, exploding with diversity and abundance. So that's the model. See if we can work towards our roadside ditch. So I wanted to talk about multi-year crop planning, because with perennials, mixing with annuals, sometimes our heads get stuck in an annual cycle. We have our 2025 crop plan, but the perennials they don't just establish in year one and then stay the same after that. They have a longer trajectory of how they grow, and they take up different space at different times. So to build that into the crop plan can be a little bit of a challenge, I found, for me as a vegetable farmer. So here's an example, just a simple one, like raspberries. In their first year, they don't need more than a 5-foot bed because they're so short. So then in between those, we got a crop. We did a cover crop in the spring, and then a carrot crop in the fall. This is how we do our crop planning, by the way. We have each column of the spreadsheet is a week of the season, and then each row is a bed on the land. So it's time and space mapped out for the whole season. I find it's visually very intuitive. So then the next year, the raspberries, need twice as much space because they're established and they're going to hang over. So then we just plant clover and sheep fescue in the path, and that's important because those, or choose the right species of clover, but you don't want those to be travelers to then compete with your raspberries. So sheep fescue is a bunch grass that stays in place. It doesn't, have rhizomes. So that was a simple example. Here it is on the land. Here's the first year. The raspberries are short, carrots in between. And then the next year, the raspberries are full grown, and we have grass, mowed grass pathways. So that same thing applies, if you're doing tree crops or alley cropping, but then you might have more years your vegetables keep, having to get narrower between the tree crops if you're doing that with like nut trees or something. So here's an example with we did peach hedgerow of peach trees, which will eventually be 3 beds wide, but for the first few years, they fit in a 5-foot bed. In the first couple of years, we even grew carrots in the bed with the peaches, because why not? They need something growing as an understory crop, might as well be a cash crop. We also interplanted honey locust with the peaches as a long-term nitrogen-fixing cover crop. If they ever get too big, we can coppice them. Also, though, I think I'm curious with the, shade as the new fertilizer, maybe they'll never get too big. Maybe that kind of sparse canopy of a honey locust will actually be a benefit to the vegetables next to them. So yeah, just some more riffs here on inserting perennials. Have your little herb circle gardens. Welcome gardens, I think, are great depending on how many customers you have to the farm. This is great marketing to just, attract the insects, attract the customers. It's great. Here's another one with that mullein growing up front. Pick your own gardens. We do pick your own flowers for CSA, and that's a mix. That's mostly annuals, but some perennials in that as well. And the birds and the insects love it too. Planted fruit trees throughout the pasture, and then, beneficial plants around the fruit trees. I will say, the grass tends to move back in, so there's some maintenance there. But then we used to grow a lot of livestock. We're now pretty much only a plant operation, but we used to have all sorts of livestock, so that's a great opportunity to rotate your livestock through the pasture around the trees. As the trees get older, that shade is actually wonderful for the livestock. You can see all the chickens are hanging out in the shade of their egg mobile there. But if the trees are taller, then they start hanging out more evenly over the whole pasture. We did put these cages around because they love to scratch up the base of the trees as they're getting established, so got to protect them a little bit. But it doesn't have to be chickens. It can be, turkeys, be sheep, whatever, but then we have pasture around the whole perimeter of the farm, so then the turkeys or sheep or whatever can insert themselves into any plot at any time. So if we have cover crop on a plot, we can rotate the livestock into that, like on the spoke of the wheel, and then rotate them back out and back around the pasture. And there's nothing more joyous for me than seeing like livestock eating down a cover crop and like providing the next year's fertility on that plot. It's a beautiful thing. So yeah, here's that kind of there's a perimeter around all the plots, and then they can zoom in on any of those plots to access the cover crop. Basically, our farm outgrew its livestock operation. We just don't have enough land for that to make sense. So yeah, we're mostly plants now. But yeah, then as trees get established, there's all the room under them. So shade gardens, I'm really into shade gardens now. They're amazing, like how much can grow under a tree, how much flowering diversity all throughout the year. And then, yeah, you have to, of course, have a swing from every mature tree. And then just whatever nook and cranny you have around the farm, just inserting flowering diversity there, too. We're leaving patches unmowed for your native diversity that will move in. Here's a community space. We have a little community greenhouse for meals and events and stuff. And this is, I love this. These are grapes grown inside there, which is a self-growing, time-released shade cloth. It's wonderful. Like as the season gets hot, the grapes leaf out. I have a friend who's experimenting with this in high tunnel production. Instead of shade cloth, if you prune your grapes just right, they can be that 30-50% shade, whatever you're going for. And they grow fruit. Amazing. But yeah, don't be fooled. Perennials require work. There's, establishing them. I would say they're like establishing, for us, they're the same as establishing annuals. Like, we're prepping the bed the same way, planting them, managing them just the same way. Just like annuals, they need mulch every year. They need weeding, spot weeding periodically. They might need irrigating initially. So it's kind of the same amount of work as an annual to establish. But then there's pruning, as they get bigger. There's trellising for some of them. There's mulching, but we're already kind of mulching everything. So that's no extra. But then there's, the spreaders, and those can really eat at you if you choose the wrong species. So I would be really careful. Do your research on what's going to spread aggressively. And then the fruiting crops, that's a whole nother job, right? You got to thin the fruits, you got to harvest the fruits, and then cutting back and dividing perennials. So all that is extra work. But pruning, is during the off season for us. It's kind of fun chance to get outside. Thinning peaches, that's a job, but then we get peaches, as a product. So worth it. And then, harvesting aronia berries, it takes a while. But, here's this last season. This isn't quite complete. We haven't totaled everything yet, but just to give a sense, this is like the revenue from selling. This is a byproduct. Selling the fruit off these things is a byproduct. It's the diversity, the beauty that we're going for. And we brought in like $11,000 from selling these fruits. And then this is also a byproduct that started, a few years after planting perennials. Is like, oh, right, you can just dig up anything and split it and sell. You dig up a clump this big, split it into 8 little clumps, plant 2 of them back. You've just increased what you had, and now you have 6 potted plants that we can sell at $6 or $7 each. We put them in 1-gallon pots. So there's real profitability there. But this is sort of a secondary thing to having the plant on the farm. But now we sell, about $15,000 worth of perennial root splittings. And we're getting into, cutting scion wood from the trees and grafting those as well. And we have a little nursery of baby trees too. So yeah, I guess in summary, the value of perennials is really hard to measure. But I see so many different angles to that value. It's really easy to feel the value when you're on the farm. So I would say, go for it in whatever way you can. And that's it. Thank you. Oh yeah, this is my book. If you want to hear more of these rants, read more of them, you can pick up a copy anywhere you buy books. Thanks. Sure. Yeah.
Having those permanent perennial roots in between your annuals, have you noticed a change in how water moves across your farm, or at least around the stones?
Yeah, the question is, having perennial roots among the annuals, did we notice a change in how water moves? Yeah, definitely. I think it moves less. It goes down more than sideways. Just thinking of the third dimension that some of these plants add to the land. Our land is pretty flat, you could probably tell. So not huge erosion risk in the first place, but we've had some huge rainstorms and yeah, fully flat doesn't exist in nature. You can tell in a big rainstorm. So yeah, these just adding 3 dimensions will cause the water to slow down and percolate in better. It just adds tilth, it adds pore space. Yeah, so I think it's a real benefit for that, especially on more sloped lands. Yeah.
Do you use different mulch for different beds or areas?
Yeah, do we use different mulch for different beds or areas? Yes, on perennials, once they're more established, like year 2 on, we'll use like wood chips or thicker mulches, or more chunky mulches that are cheaper and more abundant and longer lasting. But at the establishment phase, we'll use the same sort of screened compost, weed-free, PFAS-free, herbicide-free, all the, do your research on finding your compost. But we use that same compost that we use on our annual production. Because we're starting, we're planting little plugs, little transplants yep, we use some straw as well. Yep, wood chips we tend to have in abundance, so we use a lot of those on the perennials. Do we produce all our own compost? No, we don't. We buy in most of it. We do produce some compost, but we don't have the equipment to turn it sufficiently and screen it to create that nice, like, weed-free compost. Ours has lots of tomato weeds in it. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned like being intentional about what annual crops you're planting your perennial beds. How intentional do you have to be, like, because of shade, and also have you seen differences in fertility there? Yeah, just curious if you do really plan around that or not.
Yeah. So the question is, how intentional do we have to be about what we plant right next to the perennial beds versus more in the middle of the plot? So far, we haven't had to worry about that at all. I think it's more of as those honey locusts get taller, maybe we'll start to shift the crop plan to grow the summer greens along the edges of those. But so far, we can treat all the beds interchangeably of those plots. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not a great one to ask because our apples are just starting to bear, and we just eat them ourselves at this point. And they're funky. They're kind of like wildish apples. So yeah, not a full-on commercial orchardist. So we don't spray anything, but yeah, there might be benefits to like certain, kale and clay or whatever sprays for that. But I'm going to defer that to somebody who knows more about orchards. Yeah.
I noticed you mentioned Big Blue and Little Blue that you do utilize that.
Mhm.
With your southern Maine climate, do you find that it may not be as productive as, say, it would in a warmer climate like here in Kentucky?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, yeah. So the question was big blue, little blue stem grasses, are they as productive as they'd be here? I'm not sure, but they're pretty, like once they're established, they're pretty productive. Like we just have patches of them in our hedgerows just for overwintering habitat. We're not grazing them or anything. So yeah, productivity, I guess, is less the goal than, wild insect habitat. But they're productive, they get waist high and, yeah, are vigorous growers. Yes.
I'm just curious about when you're selling your nursery bins, especially maybe with young trees, like the soil, do you sell it with and in pots? Is there a particular mix or layer you put in there?
Yeah, great question. So what soil mix do we use in the perennial pots? We've experimented with different things, but mostly we use like our own chunky weedy compost with a little bit of layer of like leaf mulch on top, like to keep the weeds down because ours has weeds. So basically whatever you have handy, because those perennials, we dig them up in the spring and plant them in a pot, but then a few days later, ideally, the customer is taking them and planting them in their home. So it's really just like a placeholder. They're not doing a lot of growing in there. So even just straight compost would work rather than selling off your soil, your topsoil. Yeah.
Daniel, I know your species are going to be different from ours, but are there species that work well that you can take those cuttings from and then sell them, and species that you're like, yeah, I tried that, it didn't really work?
Yeah, some of them don't split. Like root splittings are harder. Like we haven't had success with like Joe Pye weed, and I'm trying to think of what else. The butterfly weed, like some of the Asclepias, don't break apart well. So now we're experimenting with actually planting out a nursery section of little seedlings that then the next year we'll dig up and sell. This is an example of the tail wagging the dog. We didn't try to be a nursery business, but now we're becoming a nursery business. So yeah, it depends on the species. Some split really well and easily, like yarrow or, the mountain mints. You can just kind of dig those up and put them in a pot and they'll grow great. Echinacea, trying to think what some of our good ones. Even the herbs like chives and thyme, oregano. We sell a lot of those. But yeah, you kind of get a sense pretty quick of like what root splits pretty well. I'd say like 80-90% of the perennials like root split pretty well. I mean, it almost feels like cheating or something. You just like you just pull up this thing, break it in, and then you're selling it off without decreasing what you had. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked about taking livestock through your beds,
Mm-hmm.
and those are permanent raised beds for my garden.
Mm-hmm.
I always worried that they destroy the beds and they do a lot of reshaping. Is there good livestock for that doesn't do a lot of damage?
Yeah, good question. So rotating livestock through permanent raised beds, do they not destroy the shape of the bed? Yes, it really depends on which livestock. Like I decided not to keep rotating lane hens through the beds because they're just such aggressive scratchers. But most pigs definitely keep out of there. But turkeys, sheep, any grazers are actually great. And we're only rotating them into a plot if there's an established cover crop. So all that root mass is holding the bed shape. So I wasn't concerned about compaction or anything, or the minimal scratching that turkeys or meat chickens might do. But the layers are the kind of exception because they get so aggressive. And once they expose soil, they all get excited and they come over and they keep digging. So I would keep them out, but otherwise, as long as you have an established crop, I'm always telling my crew, like, there's such a difference between the vulnerability of a bed with nothing growing in it and a bed with, waist high, like, dense crop cover. Because that root mass, we walk around on pasture all the time and we don't really compact it. But if that were like completely bare soil, then it doesn't have that root structure holding it together. Yeah.
Anybody else? We will have more question and answer time coming up here too. If you all want, we can take, first give Daniel a hand. But yeah, we'll take another quick break, 5-7-ish minutes, and then when we come back, we have another presenter, and and make sure to write any questions you have down, because like I said, we'll have another Q&A session towards the end.
All right, we'll start making our way back to our seats for our last presenter. Margaret Shea should be, we'll do one more presentation, and then after that we'll do like a little bit of a Q&A. We'll have like 25-ish minutes to do Q&A. So make sure as you're going through this presentation, any questions that you have for our first two presenters, and then Margaret, go ahead and write those down, and then that way we'll have plenty of time to tackle them at the end. And then, yeah. So we'll give it one more minute, just make sure everybody gets back in, and then Margaret can make her way up here.
We'll go ahead and get started. Good morning. My name is Margaret Shea, and I'm owner of Dropseed Native Plant Nursery. And I'm going to talk today again about using native plants to attract beneficial insects into your farmland. And there'll be some repetition. I'll try to move over those repeated points quickly, although some things bear repeating, but focus more on some of the new information. Since I'm speaking about native plants, I want to give my definition of a native plant that I use, and that is a plant that was here prior to European settlement. You know, Native Americans did work with the landscape and alter the landscape, but really not to the extent that it's occurred since European settlement. And I think you don't always know what's native just by, even if you're walking through a very high quality natural area, not all the plants there are native, so it's important to use a good reliable reference. What I use is Ron Jones's Flora of Kentucky, and that lists all the plants that are native here to the state. And here are a couple natives. On the bottom left is blue lobelia, and on the upper right is common milkweed. And I'll talk more about some of the species as I get into this more. It's also important to talk about the region that you're speaking of when you're talking about natives. I think some people speak about natives in a very broad, sweeping way, the natives of North America, or the natives of the northeastern U.S. When I'm talking about natives, I'm talking about a more narrow area, and it's within the interior low plateau physiographic region. And that's because the climate and the soils are very similar in that region, and I stick mostly to southern Indiana, southern Ohio, northern Tennessee, and Kentucky within that region. And I think the plants are more likely to be well adapted to the area where they're from. I do grow my plants from seed. I think sometimes when you go to nurseries, many of them sell what's called a cultivar. And you probably know this, but a cultivar is really just a cloned selection. So let's say one purple coneflower had a especially vibrant petal color or a short stature. And that's then reproduced by division over and over again. And people in gardening like that. They like the consistency, they like the tidiness, they like knowing what to expect. But there is a loss, right? And you lose genetic diversity in that population. This is a seed production plot grown from seed, and you see more variability between the individuals. It maybe looks a little messier, a little wilder, but you know, there's a lot of diversity there that you can't necessarily see, which could include the ability to withstand an unusually cold winter, or the ability to withstand insect damage. You know? So that diversity makes for a healthier population and a better chance of that population surviving and being healthy through time. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind when you're purchasing plants. You know, if you really do need that tidiness, if you're doing, you know, home landscape, sure, consider that. But if you're doing a larger planting, that diversity can really help you. So this is the reason that I grow native plants, is because we've lost so much of our natural habitat and our species over time. There's a lot of information here. I won't try to go over it all, but just some highlights. The upper map shows land cover prior to European settlement here in Kentucky. And the bottom map shows it was based on 2010 data, so more current land cover. You know, a couple highlights, and you'll see And the upper map, a pale green area in central Kentucky, that's the inner bluegrass, and that's, you know, the home of the bluegrass savanna. And if you look at the bottom map, there are no high quality remnants of that remaining. We kind of have to cobble together, you know, what that community looked like based on some poor quality remnants. It was mostly large open grown trees with herbaceous understory that was maintained by grazers. And so there have been some restoration projects, but really none of that remains. You know, another dramatic change is you'll see this semicircle of gray, and that was the prairie in Kentucky, which when I first moved to Kentucky, I had no idea we were a prairie state. But they're estimated to be about 2 million acres of prairie prior to European settlement. Now maybe 2,000 acres of remnant prairie remain. Another dramatic change, the yellow, is wetland. Obviously, that's an area that was, you know, rich, productive land. It was drained and farmed. And you'll see on the bottom map, not a lot of that remains. And, you know, in the wetland area, there has been a really concerted effort to restore a lot of that in terms of both wildlife and to prevent flooding. And that has been somewhat of a success story. So I think it is possible to restore some of this natural diversity back to our state. So as was mentioned, there are a lot of benefits to reintroducing these native plants, and I just love the plants themselves. You know, I think protecting them into the future is important just so that we can enjoy them. There are some cool plants like this flower of the hour, and it is such a tough plant for looking so delicate. It's just several inches tall, and it grows on rock outcrops that are very wet in the spring and like concrete in the midsummer. Just amazing that something can survive there. And it's a succulent, and the flower opens at 4 p.m., which is so sweet. It closes at 8 when it's in flower. So just, you know, what a joy. And then, as mentioned, you know, native plants provide food and shelter for wildlife. Some have really specific interactions, like on the left with the milkweeds. That's actually not a monarch feeding on the nectar. You know, a broad array of species can feed on milkweed nectar, but the monarch caterpillar can only feed on that. So to have the monarch in the future, we need to have those milkweed species. And on the right is another example of a species that just has a broad array of insects that use it. The oak trees have more than 300 species of mostly larvae of moths and butterflies that feed on that tree. And that, in turn, feeds our nesting birds. They really require that larva to feed their young. And I feel like I should, you know, give Doug Tallamy a percentage of my sales. He is an author. If you haven't read his books, you really should. He's written a series of books. He's an insect ecologist and really makes a great case for reintroducing native plants into the landscape, like not necessarily big restorations, but reintroducing these plants into your home landscape, and really has evidence-based reasons for doing that to enhance both insect and bird populations. So these are really a great sources of information about these. Native plants are also great at soaking up water. Like in an urban area, they can soak up stormwater runoff. And the upper left is just a diagram of creating a rain garden. And a rain garden is just, you know, a garden that is like a super permeable surface, right? It uses those native plant roots to soak up not only the rain that's falling on that garden, but from an adjacent impermeable surface, like a roof or a parking lot or driveway. And this one shows, you know, tying into the downspouts of your house to soak up that water. And you know, native plants really are great at holding soil. I often get landowners with problems like this in their backyard. And this isn't only unsightly, but it's also causing erosion into the stream that this is flowing into. So you can use native perennials or native shrubs to create something really beautiful that will enhance that backyard and enhance the stream that's connected to it. Native plants can store carbon. Honestly, any big tree can store carbon, but they've also found that native prairie plantings are equally good at storing carbon. And in that case, it's not just the roots, but the soil that the roots create that really are a carbon sink. Native plants can filter your swimming pool. This is my favorite place in the world in July and August. We created this in our backyard. And it is a swimming pool that's filtered just by native plants. It has a deep swimming area in the center and a shallow area surrounding it. The pipes are underneath the sand and gravel that the plants are put into, and there's a bubbler system that then draws water through both the plant roots, and then there's a lot of bacteria that comes in naturally to help filter that water. And you can swim in the midst of all these beautiful native plants. And this was mentioned before, but they create places of beauty. Just a wonderful place of peace and beauty that you can enjoy. And also they provide medicine and food. On the left is St. John's wort, medicinal plant used for depression. And on the right is serviceberry. It's a native understory tree. It grows kind of where dogwoods and redbuds grow, but it's super adaptable. It will also grow in full sun. And you can eat these little berries right off the tree if you can beat the birds to them. They're really delicious. And in the end, if I have a little bit of time, I'll talk about some other native edibles we've worked with. And then finally, what I'm going to focus on really is that native plants can help control pests in your vegetable garden by attracting beneficial insects. And these are a couple natives I'll talk about more, but on the left is rattlesnake master, one of my favorites, and on the right is one of our native sunflowers. So this is a map that a talented artist friend of ours, Phyllis Croce, drew for us. On the property where I have Dropseed Native Plant Nursery, my husband operates a 2-acre organic vegetable production farm called Field 51 Produce. And he has 2 acres in vegetable production that he sells through a CSA, and we also do turkeys, sheep, and chickens. And we're a very small operation. Like, he's the only employee of his operation, I'm the only employee of mine, and we rely a lot on friends and family as well. And this just shows an aerial view of that same property, and my husband's farm fields are below, and he has permanent beds that are divided by mowed lawn. And 10 years ago, we decided to add these native plantings in order to try to help control pests within his vegetables. We started with just 2 beds, 100 foot long by 5 feet wide, of native plants. And over time, we've added 5 more. So not a lot, but within that 2-acre area, we have 700 by 5 foot beds. And when I got started, this was a great starting point, a reference, a Michigan State University publication that really outlines some of the best native plants for attracting beneficial insects. And as was mentioned before, it's really important that you have plants and flowers throughout the growing season. If you want these insects to stick around, they need a food source, throughout the growing season, or else they won't stay. So obviously there's a lot of information here. What I did was use this as a starting point and then take what plants were actually native in Kentucky as well and available, and then enhance that by using things that were native here and that I'd researched and found out were good at attracting beneficial insects. And so I'll go through a list in this same order, so going from spring to fall, and show you some of the plants that have worked well for us and some that maybe are problematic as well. And these are some of the beneficial insects that we're trying to attract. The parasitoids are one. The adults feed on nectar and pollen, but it's they lay their eggs in hornworms, and then the larva will feed on that hornworm and destroy it. So you need those native plants to keep the adult present. Also, lady beetles are another great predator and control of pest species. Also syrphid flies. So these are some of the species that we're working to attract. And also we wanted to attract more of the pollinators as well. Many of the crops we grow are pollinated by insects, and many of the native bees are fabulous pollinators. I think we kind of ignore those. We think about the honeybees, but our native bees are wonderful at pollinating both the native plants and the vegetable crops. So things like the leafcutter bee and sweat bees are both good pollinators. So some of the species that we use in these plots include an early flowering golden Alexanders. And this is not only a great pollen and nectar source for a wide variety of insects, but it is a host plant for the giant swallowtail butterfly. So that gives an extra benefit to it. And it does spread quite a lot by seed, but I am going to reiterate this because it is hugely important. These beds require maintenance. And I've gotten so frustrated over the years because it's very sexy and exciting to raise funds and to plant these native gardens, but it's less exciting to maintain them over time. And I've seen a lot of people, lose these gardens because they're not maintained appropriately. And it is more work initially. You're planting, I water them for the first year, but then I do not water them at all after that, even my seed production beds. And I have not had any problems with that. But I think the harder thing is you have to weed out the non-native species, but you also have to weed out the more aggressive of the natives. And I think that's harder for people to do. I planted that. I don't want to weed that out. But if you don't, not every native plant is equally aggressive. So in a 10-year period, you'll end up with a couple species in your beds unless you weed out the aggressive ones. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. A couple times a year, I go in with a weed whacker and just circle the edge of things that are more aggressive. And that's really effective at keeping a higher diversity in those beds. Hairy beardtongue is a great species. Penstemon hirsutus. There's also Penstemon digitalis, foxglove beardtongue, another early flowering plant that's a great beneficial attractor. The nice thing about the hairy beardtongue is it's also a ground cover. And from my perspective as a grower, I get a lot of requests for ground covers to replace some of the more invasive ground covers. So for most of the year, it's just a very low growing leaf, kind of with a hairy texture and attractive. And then in the early spring, it has this 2 to 3 foot tall inflorescence. Purple coneflower is a fabulous plant. There's a reason it's been used so often. It just attracts a wide array of pollinators, and it's great for the birds when it's in seed. I think one issue with widely used plants is diseases tend to infect them, and so they can get that aster yellows, which is a viral disease. And if you see that on your plant, it just has a weird growth form, either a very broad stem or on top of the flower, another little plant growing. And you really need to just remove that plant, dig it up, don't compost it, throw it away, because that really does spread well. I have seen that, I think when you're growing plants from seed, I have seen them be attacked less often. I think, again, that diversity can help, but it's just something to consider when you're growing this species. But it's great grown with orange coneflower. They make such a great combination. There's other Rudbeckia species. Rudbeckia hirta is black-eyed Susan. I really like the Rudbeckia fulgida a little bit better. It's not as aggressive. The hirta really can spread quite a bit in your garden, and it's maybe more upright, and it flowers for a longer period of time. So I think this is really a lovely species. Again, just like the purple coneflower, that early to midsummer, long bloom, and then great seed for insects or for birds later. Gray-headed coneflower is another great midsummer perennial. It is more aggressive than the other two, so just something to keep in mind. It's called gray-headed because the seed head turns sort of a grayish color as the seeds ripen and spreads mostly by seed. It gets maybe 5 to 6 feet tall. Any of these species, though, that get taller can be cut back to keep them more compact. So earlier in the season, maybe late June, early July, you can cut them back and you'll get shorter plants and more flower heads typically as well. This is rattlesnake master. This is rattlesnake master in full flower, which I think it looks more like a weapon, really, than a flowering plant. But it was thought by the Native Americans to cure a rattlesnake bite, but I need to let you know that it does not, just so you know. But it is a great attractant for the parasitoid wasps in particular. They really love this as a source of nectar and pollen. It's also the only food source for, or an overwintering site for, a federally endangered moth species, the rattlesnake master borer moth, which will drill into the side of the bottom of the plant and lay its eggs there. And the larvae of them will overwinter in the roots of the plant. It doesn't kill the plant, but then they'll emerge in the spring. So I keep checking my plants. I haven't seen any on our property yet, but I'm hoping. So there are two genera of species that are just amazing insect magnets. And one are the mountain mints. And I'm going to show you 3 of the species of mountain mint that we grow. And honestly, when they are in flower, you can barely see the flowers for all the insects that are on it. And it's just all different types of insects. The diversity of insects is really amazing. And this is the hoary mountain mint, Pycnanthemum incanum. And it's actually pretty similar to the common mountain mint, which is Pycnanthemum muticum. Both of these are about 3 to 4 feet tall typically, and these 2 species have that white leafy bract underneath the flower. That kind of makes the flower look a bit bigger. And they're all have a nice fragrance and make a nice tea, as well as being a great insect attractant. This is my favorite one, the world mountain mint, about 3 feet tall. It does stay fairly erect. And the leaves, when they're crushed, they smell like a lemony mint. It's just a fabulous smell. And again, really are attractive to a large number of insects. So these are all spreaders. You know, when people hear mint, they get really freaked out, but it's not that aggressive. But it's the kind of species you want to, weed whack around once or twice a season to keep it from taking over other plants. And then finally, slender mountain mint, which is really lovely. It has a very narrow leaves that give it a kind of graceful texture, and it often becomes sort of mounding in the landscape, so it really will kind of fill in and keep other weeds out, which is a nice feature too. The other insect magnet genus is Eupatorium. And really when these are in flower again, they're just covered with so many different butterflies, bees, and insects. And my favorite of those is Joe Pye weed, which again is a spreader, something to keep in mind, but not terribly aggressive. It can get very tall. Like it can easily get 8 feet tall over time, which I love. I think it looks like these purple clouds, hovering above your garden. But if you want it shorter, this is one that really reacts well to being cut back early July. And then you get really more flowers, more blossoms, and a shorter stature. Another Eupatorium is boneset, a medicinal plant, obviously used to heal bones. All of these had some medicinal use, as was mentioned earlier. And it has a perfoliate leaf, which means the leaf kind of goes around the stem and forms a little cup where you get water collecting. So it's a source of water as well as nectar and pollen for insects. And then this is more common, the mist flower, which is now Conoclinum but was Eupatorium previous. And this is like a low-growing, more late summer to fall flowering plant. So the one, it does sort of form a ground cover, but the one issue with it is that it comes up kind of late in the spring. So, I found that in gardens, people sometimes forget it's there and plant something else in its place because it comes up so late, or weeds take it over. So it's something you kind of need to remember where it is, kind of keep the weeds out so that it can really thrive. Once it comes up, it's not horribly aggressive, but it can keep out the other weedy plants. And as I mentioned, milkweed is it attracts a large number of insects for pollen and nectar. But again, it's super important because it's a food source for the monarch butterfly. The larva feeds on the leaves. And this is not the monarch here, sorry. But there are several different species of native milkweed. And there's a researcher at UK who's done some work and found the butterfly milkweed is really gorgeous. It's short and it has an orange flower, but it has a very hairy, smaller leaf. So that doesn't seem to be as attractive to the caterpillars of the milkweed, of the monarch. So swamp milkweed and common milkweed have broader, smoother leaves and are more attractive. The common milkweed is great, but it is a very aggressive spreader. It spreads both by underground rhizomes and seed. So I would just exercise a lot of caution in planting that, unless you have a big space you want to fill. Swamp milkweed is like kind of the great medium. And one cool thing about native plants when you're using them in artificial settings or gardens is they can be much more adaptable than they are in nature. So for example, like swamp hibiscus, which is an obligate wetland plant. You only see it in wetland areas. In nature, it'll grow anywhere. It's really lovely in just your basic garden soil. Doesn't need a lot of moisture. And in fact, like when it grows in a wet area, it gets very big. And, but when it's just in your backyard garden, it stays more manageable, like 3 feet tall. So same with this swamp milkweed. It's native to wet areas, but it really is adaptable. It doesn't require those. It's super happy if you have a wet spot, but it'll be just fine in average soil as well. And there's the monarch caterpillar, happily feeding on a milkweed. Cardinal flower is really in demand. People love that red. It's super showy. I will say it's just a hard one to grow. It is a short-lived perennial, so typically 2 years. And it has this it's picky, right? It likes like a little bit of shade, a little bit of moisture, not too much of either. And so if you have just the right conditions, it will sell seed and come back. But it's challenging. And so what I recommend is this close relative. If you don't really need that red color, I mean, the blue will attract hummingbirds as well as many insects, and it's much easier to grow. I would suggest, like, it's a little bit happier with a little bit of shade or a little bit of moisture. So if you have that kind of a spot, I would put it in that rather than the rest of those plants, which are great in just full sun. But it reproduces well, really beautiful, makes a nice cut flower as well. I think Culver's root is a really spectacular, underutilized native perennial. I call it the candelabra plant because these white blossoms form these like candelabra-like displays. And it gets about 5 to 6 feet tall. And there's something about, I like adding these white flowers into a garden because just they make every other color seem more striking and vivid in contrast. So just from an aesthetic point of view, this and like wild quinine is another just bright white flower that really makes all the other colors pop, as well as being just great for bringing in insects. This one is, I'm going to tell you to steer away from this plant. All right? Cup plant is an amazing plant. It gets about 6 to 8 feet tall. You know, it's great for insects. It's great for birds. If you have a huge area, plant it. Otherwise, use extreme caution. It is just super aggressive. One of the cool things about it, it's another one with that perfoliate leaf. And so the leaf forms a cup around the stem. And it's a pretty big one. So really a lot of insects and birds will use that as a water source. So it's a great, fun plant to observe wildlife, but just again, super aggressive. What I would suggest maybe as an alternative is another Silphium species, compass plant. This also gets very tall, but it's just not aggressive. So the seeds are great for birds, and the flower is great for a broad array of bees and other insects. So the native sunflowers are wonderful species, but all are fairly aggressive. So I plant them in my garden, but I do have to really keep an eye on them and keep after them to keep from spreading. All of them spread clonally and by seed, but you know, they're, again, just great for birds as well as for insects, so I do like to have them. but you just have to keep that in mind. There are a number of different species. The hairy sunflower is one of my favorites. It's just about 4 to 5 feet tall. It'll grow in some shade as well as in full sun. I think the asters and the goldenrods get kind of a bad reputation because there are a couple species that are super aggressive, but I think it's really important to include these species. They are great attractants for insects, and they also flower late into the fall, which is also very important for those insects. I think a lot of us, by the time fall's here, we're like, oh, I'm done. But, we have to keep those gardens going for the insects. So New England aster is one of my favorites. I think it's really especially beautiful, and it's a little bit earlier flowering, so maybe August to September is when it flowers. But it is one of the more aggressive ones, so it does spread somewhat. Another species is the smooth blue aster. Again, it's also a spreader, something you need to keep an eye on, but it flowers later in the season, so more like September, October. It's also very attractive in the wintertime. It gets like a white fluffy seed head and kind of a silvery bracts behind it, so it's very showy. But I think my favorite one currently is the aromatic aster. And this one, in my experience, isn't very spreading at all. It forms these mounds, which again, sort of like the slender mountain mint, help keep out other weeds. So I have a bed of those that really I hardly ever have to weed. And the flower is not what's aromatic, it's the leaves. So if you have a deer issue or rabbit issue, those leaves, that odor is associated with a bad taste as well. So rabbits and deer tend to not graze on that species. And it flowers super late. It's the last thing flowering. So it's great for the insects, but it also just adds some beauty in the late season. And then I know goldenrods, like that Canada goldenrod, gives them all a bad name. Canada goldenrod is super aggressive by rhizomes and seed, but there are really a number of great dozens of native goldenrods that are not that aggressive and really wonderful for insects and birds. This is one of my favorites, stiff goldenrod. I'm sorry, all these shots really show the flower more than the whole shape, but it has a really lovely spoon-shaped kind of glossy leaf that's really attractive, as well as the flower. That flat-top flower really does have a nice gold color to it. And it's maybe 5 feet tall. But another nice one is the gray goldenrod. And this really only gets about 3 feet tall. And it's native to these rocky glades. So it's native to super poor soil. And when you see it there, it's just this little whip of a thing, tiny. But when you grow it in a decent soil, it actually gets a lovely basal rosette of leaves and a very full flower head. And again, this flowers all the way into late October, early November. So, the grasses don't necessarily attract the same number of beneficials as the flowering plants do, although there are some insects that feed on the leaves, and our native bees often will hibernate in the hollow stems of the grasses. But one thing I've found is that having that combination of grasses together with the forbs or flowering plants makes for a more stable planting. I think it's something about the roots. All the roots are fairly deep, but the native grasses have a more dense fibrous root system towards the surface, and they're great at keeping weeds out. So if you plant those together with the flowering plants, which have a more deep taproot, they really complement each other. You have to get the balance right so the grasses don't take over, but you have to plant them at the same time. But I've really found that reduces the need for all the maintenance that you might have to do otherwise. So I aim for like 40% grasses, 60% flowering plants is what I found really works well. And some of the native grasses, we've seen these before, big blue stem, which this is a really attractive native plant. It's got a great bluish green color. It has these tiers of leaves and can get about 8 feet tall, really, so just spectacular. And then switchgrass, another tall prairie grass, which maybe is more in the 5 to 6 foot range. This is it in flower, and just looks like mist hovering above the leaves when it's in flower. But then there are also some shorter native grasses. This is my favorite, prairie dropseed. This is a seed production bed, and I just want to lie down and take a nap in that. It just looks so soft and comfy. It's got this lovely fountain-like shape. It's maybe 2 to 3 feet tall. In the fall, it flowers and actually has this amazing scent. It's like this spicy, kind of almost unattractive, but just on the edge kind of scent, which is really fun. And it just, again, looks like mist hovering above the flowers. Another shorter native grass is the little blue stem, which has that lovely bluish shade in the growing season and then this gold color in the fall and winter, and also fluffy white seed heads, so very attractive. Inside oats grama, a less commonly seen, it's a very drought-tolerant native grass, about the same height, 3 feet tall, and a spectacularly beautiful flower, small but really attractive. So we did not take data from any of these plantings at our farm, although, just anecdotally, my husband saw like a complete disappearance of the hornworms after we planted the native beds. He's not had to deal with them at all. And also, he saw many more of the ladybugs in the farm fields, and he saw them actively, working on some of the beetles that are a problem. So just anecdotally, we did see an improvement. But about the same time as we did our plantings, Dr. John Sedlacek at Kentucky State University here started a trial to look at the benefit of native plants grown next to corn specifically. And he did 4 control and 4 experimental plots. Each of them had a 6-foot border, 75 feet, 6 foot, next to a corn plot that was 75 feet, 40 feet. And 4 of those had the native plants in the 6-foot wide border, and 4 of them just had pasture in that 6-foot wide. And he did find, a decreased damage to corn after the 2nd year in the native perennial plantings. So I think that study is still ongoing, so I'll be interested to see, how that progresses. But I think there is, and he also, you can read that publication, he looks at the specific beneficials that come in to those areas as well. Do I have time to talk about edibles just real quick? Okay. So we also do some native edible plantings, and I'll just tell you the ones that have worked and that haven't worked. But black chokeberry or aronia is probably our most successful crop. We have an area that was, hard to mow. It was a hillside. It was eroded. And so we just planted that in black chokeberry shrubs. And they are a very easy crop to grow and maintain. They don't have a lot of pests that are attracted to them. And the fruit itself is very bitter when you eat it right off the shrub. And the birds must find that to be true too, because they don't eat it until later in the season, I guess when they're desperate. So you have plenty of time to harvest that. And it makes, when you cook it, it really mellows out and makes a great juice. We don't have a certified, kitchen, but it's easy to get a license to make jellies and jams. So we do that, and it really makes a delicious jelly and a really popular kind of addition to our sales. And so this is the fruit of the black chokeberry. Elderberry is a really popular crop. I mean, it has antibacterial powers, I guess, as well as being a tasty fruit once cooked. The problem we have with that, we have some of those growing on our property, but the birds just love that. So I think in order to grow that effectively, you really do need to put nets over it. I think other people I know have not had nets, but I think in the early years, the birds haven't found it yet. So I think it's a matter of time when they become a problem. Pawpaw is a great native tree. This is the flower of pawpaw that smells like rotting flesh. But I think one of the issues is, and this is the fruit, dangling here, and they've actually done some studies here at Kentucky State University looking at different cultivars that do well. But this is a really popular crop. We are just starting to grow the plants. They take maybe 7 to 8 years before they start to produce fruit. It's also true, like there's sometimes issues with not having enough of the pollinator to form fruit. It's a very specific fly that pollinates the flowers. So that's one issue. The other thing is you have to have, it's not male and female, but you have to have distinct separate individuals in order for cross-pollination to occur. Sometimes, like in a natural population, you won't see any fruit forming, and sometimes that's because it's a colony of the same individual that's grown from underground roots. So you have to make sure that you have those genetically separate plants. So we're hoping to have this as a crop. We do mostly a CSA to add to our CSA basket. The other cool thing about pawpaw is it's the only, or it's one of the few food sources for the caterpillar of the zebra swallowtail butterfly. So that's a great advantage to have that come in. And that this is the zebra swallowtail on a cardinal flower. It's a spectacularly beautiful butterfly. Serviceberry is another one. It's very easy to grow a tree. It takes a while before it will produce fruit, maybe 6 to 7 years. The fruits are very small, so it's labor intensive to harvest them, but they're delicious and you can eat them right off the tree. Again, you compete with birds for them, but, and you can also make a jelly out of that as well. I really like the hazelnuts. We've done a fairly large planting of hazelnuts and are hoping to do more harvesting of them. This is like a tree/shrub that is native to the understory, but will grow in full sun. It actually grows better in full sun. And this is it in the fall, a beautiful fall color. It gets maybe 15 to 20 feet tall. And here are the fruits. The one thing, critters really do like the fruits, so it's more of a hassle to collect them when they're not ripe than when they're ripe on the right. But it's really important to catch them just before they ripen, because the squirrels just get them right away otherwise. And then you'll have to let them dry, and you'll have to remove the husk as well as the hard coating. And this is our very high-tech means of processing the hazelnut. Like I said, we use relatives and friends, but the nuts are smaller than the European hazelnuts, which are most available, but they're really tasty, really delicious. We also tried Jerusalem artichoke. We planted beds of that in the farm field. Unfortunately, I think because of the soil, the roots are edible. And these are the roots. They're like small potatoes. They get larger than this in the ground. This was from a pot. But the roots of ours grow very deep, so it's just not effective to try to harvest those and sell them or give them out in our CSA. The positive thing is they make a great cut flour. So we've been using that as an addition to our baskets from the CSA. And the flowers have this really lovely chocolatey scent to them, which is nice as well. I think the battery's dead, but that was my last slide anyway, so that worked out perfect. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions?
Yes.
How do you harvest the flowering seed, like fruit seed stuff?
Yeah, we're very low tech. We harvest by hand. Yeah. The question was, how do we harvest our seed? And we do it all by hand. I've tried different methods, you know, like for the asters and the fluffy seeds. I've tried using, you know, like a shop vac and things like that, but really, in the end, it's easier just to collect them by hand. Yes?
How are you starting your pawpaws?
So our pawpaws, we start them from seed. We also buy them in from local growers as well.
Do you plant like full pots, or are you doing rootstock?
We do pots, yeah. Yes?
Do you provide any shade for the first years of your pawpaws?
The question was, do we provide shade for the first year of our pawpaws? We have been planting them in partially shaded areas with good success. But I think, you know, they are one of those species, they're native to the shade, but they really do produce more fruit when they're grown in full sun. But when they're very young, they're vulnerable. So it is a tricky plant to get established and slow growing. But I found that in partial shade, they do fine as young plants. Yes?
I have two questions. First, are a lot of the perennial flowers frost tolerant when they're seedlings, or is it best to wait until May to start those outside the greenhouse? And then the second question is, a lot of the literature about species in the food family, so like false indigos, talk about acid scarification for the seeds
Right.
using sulfuric acid. That makes me nervous at home. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah. So the question is about starting the plants. Are the seedlings frost tolerant? That was the first question. And, there's a reason why plants, they need to be stratified. Many of them have to go through winter before they'll germinate. And it's because they don't want to have this little seedling coming up in the fall and having to go through winter. So that is a vulnerable time for them, and that's not a good time to plant the young seedlings, right? So one thing you can do is you can plant many of the seeds out in the fall and let them go through a natural stratification period. Or you can put them in the refrigerator in moist sand and do that artificially and then plant them out in the spring. I grow different sizes of plants, so I grow plugs, which are small plants, but they're more than seedlings. And in that case, planting those grown plants in the fall is a better time, is what I found, because it's just less stress on the plant. Everyone gets excited to plant in the spring, but you get the plants in the ground and then they have to go through that summer, which can be brutal, and you have to do a lot of watering for them to really, survive. When you plant in the fall, they have time to get their roots established, and then they're fine to go through the winter, and they get those early spring rains, which help them settle in. So I think for when the plants are grown, the fall planting is the way to go. And the other question was about scarification. Some of the hard-seeded plants like the false blue indigo, the baptisia, the Illinois bundleflower have that hard coat. And I don't use sulfuric acid either. I usually just put them between a couple pieces of sandpaper and scratch them up, and that works really well for scarification. So those plants they're often like eaten by birds or something that will, make nips in the plants, and that helps with germination. So, yes?
When you had that map that said EPPC that was, and then you had the region map, what was EPPC that had the historic baseline plant community conditions?
EP. Oh, I think it was sponsored by the Exotic Pest Plant Council.
I was just curious how to find that again because it was such a useful picture of the kind of change over time of the historic.
I'll give you my email. I can send that to you. I'd be happy to. That's a great map. She was asking about the map of historic vegetation versus current land cover.
And regions too, the plateau, the hybrid plateau.
Right, and also the map of the interior low plateau with the different subregions in that. I'm happy to send that to anybody. Just get in touch with me afterwards or send me an email. Any other questions?
There's some plants that need a double dormancy for stratification. If you're going to try to do that with the refrigerator, would you take it out of the fridge and let it warm up and then put it back in the fridge? Would that satisfy that seed's needs?
So the question was, some plants need a double dormancy, so they need to go through 2 winters basically before they'll germinate. I am super low tech, and so when I have trouble germinating something, what I do is I put it in a flat and put it outside, and see what happens. And hopefully in a couple of years I'll get something. If not, okay. But there are some species that have really special requirements like that is more tricky to deal with. And and it's interesting too, the rattlesnake master, for example, I think that one kind of scares me because it has a long dormancy period. I think it needs 3 months. And I think we're getting less and less of that because we're really seeing declines in that species. So I'm trying to propagate it artificially, using the refrigerator to do that, hoping to get more of that out in the world. Anything else? Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all the speakers for those wonderful presentations. Just a couple housekeeping things. There are yellow sheets that I passed around. Those are feedback forms for Oak. We would really appreciate you filling those out. And additionally, there are some folks at KSU in the workshop that are doing some agroforestry work, and they have a survey that they would really appreciate your feedback on, and they're going to be handing flyers out for those at the door. So if you could take a look at those, that would be great. And I think it's a QR code that you can then fill out on your phone, and that's for a project they're working on. So that would be great to do too. And now we're just going to have all the speakers come up here, and we're going to do kind of more an open-ended discussion and more questions to kind of wrap up for the next 20 minutes or so.
Specific questions for any of the speakers? Anything that we covered, anywhere from profitability from hedgerows to establishing plants, or anything in between? Because I can ask them questions all day if you want. That's fine too. Just want to make sure. Yep. Are there any details to that? Do you want to step over when you talk to, just to make sure everybody hears it? Are there any details for that? Like you just pay a fee and then you're good to go?
I guess it's through the UK Department of Entomology is where you get a nursery license. And like I said, it's $25 a year. And they supposedly come and inspect. You know, I'm not sure how often they really do that, but yeah.
I think it's 40. I mean, I think it's.
Oh, 40?
I think it's 20 if you start midway through the season, and then I think a year.
Sorry, it's $40 a year. Thank you.
On that nursery license, NRCS considers nursery agriculture. So if they're looking for somebody in the agriculture, a nursery is what they're recommending.
There you go. Other questions in that vein?
This is like a little vaguely formed, but okay, we're working with Zeglin Institute, and they do this ecological outcomes verification deal on mainly grazing lands. And to do that, you're like establishing baseline conditions. You're like, this is the baseline condition. This is like the peak productivity that's possible for this eco type. That's why I'm interested in your map. But I would be really, I mean, you're like, you know, you turn a whole hayfield into something very intensive, but then you're sensitive to the ditches. Like, you guys are all just, if you're doing research, like in a place that has funding to experiment, like you're all like really in this. I would be really interested to hear you riff about baseline conditions and sort of like the ecosystem potential that these native plant ecosystems have, and how to go that direction. But like I said,
I have one thing to say on this. So there's a yeah. So that's kind of a hard. I'll try. I think she's interested in baseline conditions of different like environments throughout, like a specific site you have, like what the baseline maybe native plants were on that site and the productivity. Is that kind of what you're asking for? Like how to find out what the original.
how can we even imagine? Like,
Yeah.
I don't have any idea. A lot of people are thinking about it, but I just think it's really
Yeah.
to talk about it.
There are maps, like if you're familiar with Web Soil Survey, you can go online and like look up your area and look up what ecoregion that's not ecoregion, it's not the right word exactly, but basically a map of what all the native species growing in that particular site, like down to the soil level and environment, taking into consideration slope, elevation, all that, like exactly would be. So you can easily find that data for yourself and then kind of go back and match like what would be growing there to what your purposes are. I don't know if that's helpful.
I'll jump in there too, just stepping back even more, like just talking about sustainability and you know, the world we want to create and live in. I think there's no path towards sustainability that doesn't involve reintegrating humans into biological landscapes. So I just want to like plug our intuitive cultural connection to these you know, the land and plants. And we have all these resources to access, like, you know, the different kinds of plants that are native, but to like just get involved, like walk the land and watch. You know, I can take a soil test each year and that'll tell me something, but a lot more is, I learn a lot more just walking the land and seeing the birds, feeling the life coming to it. So I think, yeah, I guess that would be my riff on your saying that.
Yeah, so that's like the nearly impossible question to answer, right? But there's these old journals that I've read of people who were like new to this country, and there's things that they say like, you know, grasses were chest high on horseback, and that there were flocks of birds so big that they would like block out the sun. You know what I mean? And these are all completely from the journals of people who you can't necessarily say are reliable at all. But you have to imagine when we had 6 feet of incredible topsoil with huge native grasses and the amount of life that could support. I mean, I think that it's probably beyond what we can imagine currently. I would have to imagine.
I can't quote them exactly, but U.S. Forest Service has some really interesting publications that have looked at, I don't think intangible is not the right word for it, but the productivity of natural ecosystems beyond harvest, you know, beyond like the board feet. And they look at things like the water, you know, cleaning water, providing healthy watersheds, providing oxygen, carbon storage. And they've actually put some numbers on those. So I would look at the U.S. Forest Service for some of those publications.
And Margaret, you mentioned there were other groups working on reestablishing some of the original Kentucky sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I think groups like the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission would be a great source of information, as well as the Kentucky Nature Conservancy, are 2 organizations that both, you know, work on surveying what's left in the land and working to protect it and restore it. So those would be 2 places to start.
Nature Conservancy, that's like a state branch of like the Nature Conservancy.
That's right. It was the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission. Yeah, it's a mouthful, but you know, they're a state organization that's focusing on plants and natural communities. They have a system of nature preserves throughout the state. And yeah, they've surveyed Kentucky county by county, and what they found is that 0.5% of the state is left in high quality natural conditions. You know, so it puts an imperative on us to.
Other questions about that? Yep. Or anything else? Go ahead. Anything else is good.
In relation to the Greenacres, are you, now that you guys have warm season grasses established, I know that's not your forte, but now that you have them established, are you seeing more people in Brown and Claremont, maybe Holland, or in the region adopting that, or not so much yet?
Obviously, it takes 3-ish years to fully adopt any of these things, right? For warm season natives specifically, to really be like, this is adopted now. We're having field days out there, and we're seeing huge excitement. You know, being able to beat the summer slump, things like that for grazers is really important. And I'll tell you that the thing that is the most convincing to people is, 1, the explanation of how to do it, but 2, just like I kind of said, standing in those fields. You get a bunch of grazers out there middle of July, and we're seeing people who are from all kinds of different backgrounds getting excited. But so, you know, our project is, I think we're in year, it's 5 now, 7 or 8 years of this. And so like, I think that in the next couple years, we'll really start to see what kind of implementation others are able or are doing in that region. But I will say it's a lot more excitement than I was expecting, which is really cool to see. Mm-hmm.
Also on that, there's another climate smart project called it's a grazing focused project by Tennessee State, and a big part of their project, they're working with a lot of larger producers in planting native seeds, like we talked about, native pasture. So that is being implemented now and starting up, and that'll be a lot of growers that are kind of getting on board and putting that into practice. So.
Yeah, follow-up for Ian. Do you have any fields where you're not using fire, just for those landowners that are interested in doing that?
Yeah, you just, we do. You just have to manage a little bit more intensely with mowing or a little more intensely with grazing. Fire is like such a nice wipe the slate pretty clean every once in a while. And so like I said, we only do it every 3 to 4 years, but if you're not interested in it, I think there's more mechanical controls that you would want to implement, or maybe changing your grazing strategy to be a little heavier during years where you're starting to see some stuff pop up or something like that. I think there's some options there for sure. I would say fire's most effective, but that's not the only, as always with agriculture, that's not the only tool in the toolkit. Yeah.
I had a question for Daniel. I'd be interested, you said you're growing for 14 years now, and I'm interested in your beginnings. I'm at the very beginning of things, and I feel myself drawn into too many directions. You said you had sheep, but your farm outgrew the sheep, and so I'm like, how was, any tips you can give for, you know, the beginning and to see how did you start up and when did you start selling and things like that?
Yeah, I'd say to summarize the question, it's how to avoid hyper diversifying. Yeah, it's tough starting out. I was just so gung ho, I just wanted to try everything, and there's a beauty to that, but it definitely just kind of created chaos and stretched me thin. So I think focusing on like a core enterprise that, honestly, I really focused on the financial side of things to begin with to start a business. So vegetables were pretty good for that in my area. So I'd encourage that. Find that core enterprise that you really want to sink your teeth into, and maybe hold off on some of the side things in the beginning until that economic heartbeat is going. And then from that, you can spin off into other things. I learned that the hard way. I started with too many things and then had to scale back.
Yep.
Is there an easy definition for grasses versus forbs and those other things? Like rattlesnake master, I think, is a grass,
It's actually a forb.
which is what I was gonna guess next.
There is a definition. I don't know that I remember it to tell you the truth. I mean, because grasses do flower as well, but it's the form of the flowers. I mean, they're all, you know.
Is it related to a yucca? I mean, it reminds you of yucca.
Rattlesnake master is related to a yucca.
That helps sometimes if somebody's never seen it.
Right.
I have it and I put it in a wrong place. So you can
I mean, grasses are all monocots. That's one thing. Not all monocots are grasses, but they all have those parallel veins. And they have a different form of their flower, which is more subtle, I guess, than the forbs. That's not a very good definition, but it's a definition.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Daniel. If I was thinking about, you were talking about science and research and that sort of stuff, is there anyone coming onto your property doing any research? Or are you getting, I don't know, questions from universities and that sort of thing, getting approached to have research done on your property? And maybe a follow-up to that would be, is there anything, and this would be same for you, Margaret, anything that you would love to know, like would have somebody come out and do the research?
Yeah, do we have any research going on the farm? We're a part of a no-till research project right now, which is looking at fertility stuff in the soil, because all the fertility wisdom of the modern day is based on, tilling it in. So as opposed to like a deep compost permanent bed mulch. So yeah, we're working with University Extension on a SARE grant with that. People have come. We've had different NRCS groups come out to sort of do soil tests. We're part of that, whatever it is, 1,000 Farm project. I forget the name of the organization doing that, sort of trying to test a wide variety of things. But I tend to be, maybe I've given that away, I tend to be more like of the gut, like the farmer's footsteps is the best fertilizer. Yeah, and there was a second part.
If there was anything you would like to know. Like
Oh yeah, I'm definitely driven by the questions I get that I can't answer, and a lot of those are to do with yeah, how does fertility work? You know, how uptake, binding up of fertility in a deep compost mulch system. So that's one we're working on right now.
Do you have any insight on that?
We're just starting the research, but yeah, my answer to everything actually is cover crops. It gets the flywheel of life spinning in the soil so that nutrients become available, diseases and pests are diminished. So yeah, whenever I see no-till issues with fertility or with diseases starting to increase, I'm always like, how much cover cropping are you doing? And usually it's not very much.
And I'm curious too, Margaret, do you have research going on your property right now, especially in regards to like beneficials and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, we do not have any research going on now, but I would love to have that kind of information. And I mentioned the book by Doug Tallamy, and I'm so envious because, you know, he cites these examples of like his own land, and he has the, you know, species list from prior to replanting, you know, all the insects as well as all the birds, and then 15 years in, he has listed all the insects and all the birds, and it's so dramatic and so compelling. I would love to have that because it's just this great like advertisement for people to really, you know, try to do this in their own yard to see amazing results. So yeah, that's something I'd like to get.
Yeah. Ian, is there anything that they're not studying yet on your property that you're feeling like?
No, I think we're fortunate to have most things. I mean, we have some cool projects with biochar and other stuff like that. The thing about research is it takes time, and the other thing about research is it's hard to meld research with production, right? Hey, I want to test this. Let's just like try this natural spray on this crop and let's see what happens. Like that's from a farmer's perspective, that sounds like a great test. From a research perspective, they're like, okay, where's your control? Where's this? You need different treatments. This needs to be standard. And what you end up with research on a farm, unless someone's just coming and pulling data, which is awesome, is like a reduction of production in a lot of ways, which is very difficult. And so there is this kind of hard relationship between research and agriculture, and research is inherently reductionist. Right? How do I limit all the factors down to check this one thing? And agriculture is the opposite of that. It's the opposite of reductionist. So we do limit how much research we do on the farm because it impacts production pretty heavily when we really get going with it. So it's an interesting relationship.
Yeah. Any questions off that stuff? Cool.
I think there's 2 whole presentations on the conference about on-farm research, so if you're interested.
And Marissa, also, I was wondering, like, what are some things that you're seeing from your perspective, like traveling out to see those farms, in regards to perennial production that you feel like, I mean, just as much as like the question maybe people aren't asking, like when you're actually there and they're like, I want to do this thing, is there anything that you're seeing that is coming up again and again? Maybe as it pertains to
I think the
perennials?
biggest thing is people that have underutilized land that's just been on part of their property. Maybe it's sloped, they didn't put their fields there, they're not growing anything on it, but they don't want to start over. Like they don't want to rip everything out, spray it out, and plant fresh, but they want to like reestablish that to be something more productive, maybe to take out the invasives and plant more native plants and to find the middle ground as to how to do that in a feasible way without it being too overwhelming if it's like 3 acres of land or something. And then also for our project, how to fit that into the project. I think in terms of the practices, there's not something straightforward into how do you do that. And a lot of people, that's like the land that's underutilized and they want to turn into something more productive, but we have to figure out a way to kind of put these practices together or piece them apart to like renovate those lands but not starting over. Like ultimately from our project perspective, we're not going to start like from scratch and like tear a landscape down and rebuild it, but we need to kind of figure out how to incorporate these practices into like what's already there, I guess.
Great. Also, I figured I would also turn a question to you all because this may elicit more questions. Are there things preventing you or have been preventing you from starting perennial production in any way? Or are there things about perennial production that are attractive that you feel like you could implement that you heard today? That maybe just sharing that might also have some, there may be other things that Daniel or Ian or whoever will think of that are like, oh, that's a mistake I made, or that was a way I went about it that wasn't necessarily right. So is there anything, I don't know, either holding you back or any specific interests that you have in perennial production? Does anybody want to chime in on that? Yeah, Taylor?
I have a thought. I work for an organic wholesale distributor, and we're always looking for more like specialty fruits at this point, especially grown locally. So like blackberries, we never have enough blackberries, and we never have enough. Like kiwi berries are a big one right now; they're becoming popular, and pears and Asian pears and persimmons, and so just stating that as like, I think some of those could really work well in these systems on a small scale, and if you have like a total acre of like persimmons, for example, like that could be really beneficial. So just, I don't know, I think I'm just wanting to encourage people to think about, yeah, like putting these cash crop hedgerows into their system, I think is a really cool idea, and like there are businesses that are like excited about that from like a local perspective. Or
But I think that's true. I mean, I believe Marissa's going to say something about that. But to your point, there is a market for more perennial production. We are also in a very humid climate, so some of those things can be a little difficult. So I don't know. I didn't want to.
Yeah, for fruit production specifically and just these like tree perennial plantings, a lot of people want something that they can put in, and in a couple years they'll have like a harvestable crop that's relatively easy to maintain, that they don't have to spray, and that they're going to make some money off of. And like figuring out that one size fits all like doesn't really exist. And I think what, I don't know if it was Ian or Daniel said something about having the goal be like all the additional benefits you're getting when you're putting in a hedgerow, like looking for the environmental benefits you're getting, the beauty benefits, like all those things being like the primary purpose, and the revenue being like a benefit, like an additional benefit is like a good way to look at it. Because the profitability of these things, if you're putting in like a hedgerow and thinking you're gonna make like a profit off of it, even these perennial plantings, it's definitely not guaranteed, maybe not that likely, but it's like a great external benefit if you can make it work in that way.
Anything you all want to add to that?
The only thing that I would add to that is you know, I hear that and I hear persimmons and they're in high demand. You go, cool, I'm going to put an acre of persimmons, and in what, 8 years I'll get you know what I mean? I'll get a crop. And who knows if in 8 years, if persimmons are still in demand. Maybe they will be, maybe I'll like clean up. But I think that's financially just a tough thing. And what I was kind of getting at earlier too is like, so say you put in persimmons and 3 years in, you're like, okay, we're getting closer. And then some drought happens, or some too much rain happens, or a tornado. Like it's a very, if a lettuce crop gets destroyed, I can replant it today. You know what I mean? If a persimmon crop gets destroyed, it's just a lot harder. And so it's a larger, I think it's large. I would, maybe Daniel has more insight than I do, but I think it's a larger risk to put in perennials, because you're hoping for that payoff and you don't know whether it's going to be there when you get there or not, especially for these longer term perennials. I think like things like blackberries are a lot simpler and like a quicker turnaround. But anything that's a tree is kind of scary to me personally.
Yeah, I think Marissa's right on. Like, I wouldn't go planting a beneficial bed with the primary goal being to profit off of it. It's really the stacking of all those benefits, and then you get a little revenue too. Maybe that helps pay for some of the labor to maintain it. But like that mentality, otherwise you're going to be disappointed and frustrated. I mean, yeah, this isn't a talk on like commercial orcharding, which would be probably a different set of, learnings. So yeah, I think really focusing on the stacking diversity benefits of these things. And again, just focus on that. What is that core economic heartbeat that is sustaining your business? It's probably not the beneficial beds. Yeah, but they all feed into that. But focusing on that core to make sure he can pay the bills each month.
Yep.
You said something earlier about everything's medicine, in some capacity. So sometimes, with regard to persimmons, I think a lot more about even if the fruit doesn't make it, the leaves are there. Been a medicine forever, and great for animals. So
Yeah, plant persimmons, definitely. Plant persimmons, but maybe not a whole acre. I don't know. Yeah.
Establishing perennial fruits seems like a good idea on your farm, and I feel like there's a market for it that's lacking locally. It's kind of what I'm trying to say. So yeah, sorry. I'm trying to encourage everyone to just go plant a bunch of trees in my house.
Well, you never know, even if they're not the trendy fruit in 8 years, you can still eat them. People can eat them, animals can eat them. But that's kind of goes with what y'all said.
Maybe we can do one more and then we'll wrap it up and have lunch. Anybody else? Yep.
Just to add on to last question, I guess maybe sometimes perennial things, you see all these really nice established and all these pot plants brought in. I take a little bit of a slow approach. And I don't know, most of my income comes from off farm, so I've been building my farm for 7 years now, and still making no money off of it basically. But it's given me some time to let some of these hedgerows just kind of do things on their own. And what I've noticed, this land, at least in Robinson County, Kentucky, it was just hay for probably 30 years, 2 or 3 times a year. I let it go. There's persimmons, red buds. These identified this year, finally, luckily, I'm like, what is this other flowering white tree other than Calvary pear? It's these wild palms are coming up. So, if you have time and space, sometimes you just kind of let something go, stop mowing, and maybe go along with the head shears here and there. Oh, there's something I don't want to cut, and things just, they're forming.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at all these plants, and I'm like, oh, well, maybe some of these are weeds or something, they're filling in patches, and it seems like it's maybe working out.
Yeah, I think there is something to leaving a little bit of wildness too. I didn't talk a lot about my farm today or any about my farm today, but we have a whole section on our back property that's just too wet, it's too dense, and it's too hilly and shady. It's not a great place to grow food. But we've kind of let it go, and basically I have a neighbor who mows it just at the end of every year. And this year was the first year I heard the bobwhite quail. And I was like, that's awesome. That's just, you mow it once, the neighbors hate it. They're like, will you please mow it? But I mow it once, it has ironweed and goldenrod and ageratum and all these things blooming in it. And then, you hear the bobwhite and you're just like, well, that's victory right there. So, yeah, something to be said for at least a little bit of wildness. Everybody, big round of applause for our speakers. I'm sure they will be around because I think it's lunch right now, right, Jackson? I'm sure any of them there willing to answer your questions. So appreciate you all coming out.